I think it's really necessary, just whatever I think of to throw down there, and then I'll dump a whole bag of compost or something on that, so that I've got a mound about this big around. And we'll talk about spacing on all these things in just a minute. But then I'll kind of, put a hollow in the middle of it, and I'll water it every couple of days, every time I go down in the garden. And then when I'm ready to plant my squash, I'll go and I'll poke about 8 or 10 seeds just down into the ground in that, big mound. And usually most of them germinate, and I'll go back in a week later and I'll pull up all except maybe the 4 or 5 strongest ones, because squash does grow. There are bush squashes that don't grow as quickly, and there are vining squashes, I don't know if there's plural there or not, but anyway, that will really spread out. But I do that with squash. Cucumbers, for the most part, there are bush cucumbers, but I find that the best ones are the vining cucumbers. And on those, you need a pretty strong trellis to grow them on. I use the bull wire, the cattle panels, and I just stick some cedar posts in and put that 20-foot run of wire up and just plant my cucumbers along the base. Yes?
I have that along one of my sides. Unfortunately, there's a stone wall behind it, so they don't get the afternoon sun. Is that why I didn't have much luck?
You
I mean, the top of the plant gets the afternoon sun,
Yeah.
but the bottom does not.
Either you're not fertilizing enough, because my cucumbers go from ground level to stone wall level in about 5 days when they start growing.
Okay.
Grow some of the old-fashioned varieties too. Grow some lemon cukes, grow some Armenian cukes, some of these things that really do grow. You may have also been growing bush cucumbers.
No, they were
will
vines.
grow up. Well,
Okay.
they
okay.
should have been growing a lot faster.
All right.
But they'll get up above it.
But the sun, but that half of the plant is not a big deal in the shade.
Not a big deal. And with all the melons and with squash and with cucumbers, the first several blooms that open on the vine are male flowers. They produce nothing but pollen, and they will not produce fruit no matter what you do. Because I get this call every year, my plants have lots of flowers on them, but I'm not getting any squash. We'll call Cappy Lawton. He'll take your squash blossoms and make the best soup in the world out of it. But you're never going to get squash or cucumbers or melons from the male flowers. In that first little section of stem, you're going to have mainly male flowers, and that's probably the main reason you never got any cucumbers produced from them. Then, as the plants mature, the flowers begin having both male and female parts. They have stamen and pistils as well. And then, if you've got some good insect activity, then you'll get plenty of pollination and plenty of produce. Biggest problem with cucumbers can be spider mites. Spray with liquid seaweed, you won't have problems with spider mites. Biggest problems with squash, you can get mildew on the foliage. You can stop the mildew with the plant wash. We're going to be experimenting with messenger to stop it this year. You can really slow it down spraying compost tea on the foliage. Some people will spray garlic. And garlic is a very good natural fungicide. But garlic also repels bees. And cucumbers and squash, you really want the bees coming in to pollinate the flowers. So I don't use garlic on my squash, my cucumbers, things like that. If I'm fighting stink bugs and things like that, I may spray my tomatoes with it, but not on squash or cucumbers, because I want those bees coming in to pollinate the flowers. If you have no bees, plant some fragrant flowers around your garden and get the bees coming in. Take an old plastic plant saucer, make up some sugar water like you put in the hummingbird feeder, float a sponge or two in there, and man, the bees will come in to feed on that and absolutely love it. Honey's better still. And you want bees around the garden if you're going to get things that have to be pollinated by insects like squash, cucumbers, melons, cantaloupe, things like that. Squash bugs are one insect that gets after the squash fruit when it starts to come out. I find that early in the year you'll have a handful of squash bugs, show up. Now squash bugs, and if anybody has to go, I understand. You're not embarrassing me if you have to get up and run off the kid's soccer game or whatever. But squash bugs do not like water. And I make it a point, even if I'm not really watering my plants, I'll walk through the garden with a hose and I'll get down my developing mounds of squash. And then when those first squash bugs show up, I think it's by spontaneous generation, they all come running up to the top of the leaves. Now once again, I usually wear a thin plastic gardening glove, and that's the end of the squash bug. And if you keep up with that for about the first 2 weeks they show up, you'll virtually never have squash bugs later in the season. But if you've got them, you're going to have a whole lot of them. If you're going to resort to an insecticide to try to kill them, Neem is one of the better and safer things to use in the garden, made from an Indian tree, 100% organic, and pretty effective against squash bugs. Greenlight's product they call Bioganic. This is very effective against most stink bugs and squash bugs and things like that. But in the heat, it will burn the foliage. So be careful about spraying this stuff in the hot part of the day. The one other thing that I'll tell you about squash, and it hasn't been a problem in my garden for several years now, but some people get a little insect called the squash vine borer. And it tends to, shortly after the squash plant comes out of the ground, real near where it comes out of the ground, there's a little moth, lays an egg, this little worm gets inside of the stem and starts hollowing it out, and will lead to poor production, and the vines will die prematurely. Two things to do about that. If you're growing really vining squash, when it gets out a little ways, take a shovel full of dirt and just put it over a leaf about a foot or two out. The vine will put down roots from that point. The borers are always up more just where it comes out of the ground, and it can kill out that section of stem, and this section out here will keep on growing. I told you about BT to kill caterpillars and worms of any sort. This is the powdered form of BT, which is called dipel, or some people say dipple. I think dipel's right, but who cares? Dipel dust will effectively control the squash borers before they get into the vine. And if you're concerned or if you've had problems with borers in the past, go out once a week or so, and this stuff's cheap, $5.75 for this thing, and just dust this over the center, you know, of your little hills of squash coming out, and this will stop your squash vine borers before they ever get in the plants and get started.
You put it on the plant?
Yeah.
Dust it on the plant?
Yeah, dust it on the little plants where they're first coming up out of the ground, and it'll get the before they really get into the vine.
That'll do cucumbers too, right? That'll do any kind of...
It'll do anything, but I don't think I've ever had a problem with vine borers and cucumbers. What's that?
Pumpkins.
Pumpkins, very definitely. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Put anything when you actually plant it to remove them?
No, because anything that would stop them would be poison, which would be taken into the plant, and there are no poisons in my garden, and I hope they're not in yours. This you just dust it on after the seedlings emerge, and it works just fine. Yes, ma'am.
On cutworms, on tomatoes?
BT will work very well against cutworms. Yeah.
And those little black beetles, black and yellow, nothing besides pushing them?
The neem will have some effect. The
Okay.
Bioganic will have some effect, and liquid spinosad. I don't know if we have any of it out here.
I've done spinosad on them, and it didn't affect them at all.
Well, it did. You just didn't see it. The
Yeah,
problem with
I
things
didn't
like
see
spinosad is it'll take 3 or 4 days to kill them,
Oh.
and they've gone off somewhere else to die. And in the meantime, a whole new crop has moved in. But they're just like the squash bugs. If you get out there very early on
Okay.
and kill them before they lay eggs, you'll
Okay.
have very few further problems.
Cool.
Now, it appears that this may be a bad year for grasshoppers once again.
Oh, no.
If you start seeing little grasshoppers, there is a bacterial bait that you can put out that makes them sick. I'm not going to tell you it kills them, but I'm not sure that you want to kill them necessarily. The bait contains a bacteria called Nosema locustri. You don't have to remember that, but you'll see bait sometimes sold as Nolo, N-O-L-O, and that's what it's short for, is Nosema locustri. Nowadays, we get it much more commonly under the name of Semaspore, S-E-M-A-S-P-O-R-E. It only works on young grasshoppers, so you want to get it out when you first start seeing grasshoppers. And what it does is it makes the grasshoppers sick and makes them stop feeding, so they're going to stop doing damage. But grasshoppers are highly cannibalistic. And when one grasshopper sees a sick grasshopper, it's going to try to go over and eat it. And when it does, it gets the bacteria and it gets sick, and then somebody eats it. I love it. Cannibalism. But if you got grasshopper problems, go after them before they get bad. The other thing that so many people pass up doing, and it's so much fun, is put a bird feeder in your garden.